In this episode, we will look at the dark past of pride activism. Though the word pride has not always been the term of choice it is today, it was nonetheless part of the ethos behind the early days of gay liberation. We'll start, among others, with Magnus Hirschfeld, the scientist who spun a web of ideologies that range from equity to eugenics, and whom biographer Elena Mancini reminds us, quote, encourage his patients to deepen their self-understanding of their conditions or desires, and advise them on how to both live in a manner that promoted their authenticity and prevented them from falling victims to the laws. Pride in the erotic behavior was, and still is, part of the movement. We'll look at the radical steps taken by what has been coined in times past as the U.S. homophile movement, which refers, as the Library of Congress, to, quote, the local, national, and international social political movements for gay and lesbian rights, which emerged following World War II. We will look at these social political movements that eventually led to the politicization and commemoration of the Stonewall uprisings in Greenwich Village, New York City, and how this one event sparked the Pride Month celebration we still see today across America. If you have never known the roots of Pride Month, but perhaps have wondered how it all began, you don't want to miss the rest of this podcast or the next few episodes that will be released before the presidentially proclaimed Month of Pride is over. You're listening to the Mind of Ms. podcast. At the Mind of Ms. podcast, we work to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ as we engage with the culture from a biblical worldview. Our first goal is to engage people of faith in a deeper understanding of Scripture while reaching out to the unbeliever, that they may hear the gospel taught in a way consistent with the Bible, which we believe can change their lives and bring them to salvation. Our second goal is to create an awareness of how culture disintegrates without a proper understanding of the Bible and the valuable truth found in it. Our third goal is to use technology to create awareness of truthful biblical teachings and increase the overall footprint of biblical truth online. All of this takes resources. Your support will directly impact the Mind of Ms. podcast in reaching more people and help us cover the costs that come with a growing organization. We thank you for your financial support and thank you for helping move the gospel forward. Now, back to the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome. You're listening to the Mind of Ms. podcast. This is your host, Mizraim Rivera. So today's episode is titled A History of LGBTQ Activism. The history of this movement, well, it goes back a very long time. And we want to show how it developed and grew into the seemingly unstoppable movement that it is today. This topic is what is considered a hot button topic, and such things are hot button because the opinions on either side are usually deeply rooted in belief systems and are diametrically opposed. I, of course, have my own opinion to share on this, but not from a conservative perspective or even a right-wing perspective or a liberal leftist one. My approach, well, it's biblical. That's what I like to call it. And that is my world view. And that is how I approach everything in my life. I do sometimes wish that approach would make me perfect, or at least that I can do it perfectly. But the truth is, well, I'm far from perfection. In fact, if I had to guess, many people that come across this episode and any other episodes like it may not actually agree with me much. And maybe, even though you don't know me, you may not like me. Nonetheless, I do hope to start a dialogue that will at least expose people to biblical truths that have been discarded in our society, or at least are not highly esteemed any longer. we all reflect the image of God badly. We all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And if you believe this, then the questions follow. This is the question: why would you stay in your sin? Paul from prison wrote to the church in Ephesus, "As a prisoner of the Lord," he said, "I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling that you have received." You see, God no more calls homosexuals than he does gossipers to himself. He calls people to himself, and people have no choice but to come as they are. But scripture does not allow for the mindset that says, God called me as I am, therefore he validates my sin. With that in mind, and knowing at least some of my approach on this topic, we'll move on to the next segment. You're listening to the Mind of Miz podcast. Hello family, Miz here. I'm jumping in really quick to remind you that you can check out everything we have going on at the Mind of Miz by going to mindofmiz.com. While there, you can check out our forum, blog, and videos. You can also check out our support page. We drop episodes twice a week. If you like what you hear, then follow, like, subscribe, and share. You can find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. That's enough for now. Let's get back to the podcast. Welcome back. You're listening to the Mind of Miz podcast as we dive into talking about the history of LGBTQ activism. You may find that you hold a presupposition about homosexuality, which is the term that I will use often in its original sense, of course, which is basically the same thing as saying same-sex attraction, okay? My goal is not to reduce here to a term, a community, but I just don't want to get bogged down in the hundreds, if not thousands, of qualifying terms that I would have to use to make everyone happy, which is, well, that's definitely not my goal. For example, one acronym considered by the Middlesbrough Council in North Yorkshire, England in 2018 was this. Get ready for it. Let me take a deep breath in. LGBTQIP2SAA. Oh, don't make me say that again. And according to helpfulprofessor.com, there were at least 81 types of genders and gender identities. So I will then limit my terms to homosexual, gay, LGBTQ, and I may use other terms, but moving on, I think you get the point. Presuppositions. That's what we're talking about here. You have them, and guess what? I have them, and hardly can we avoid them. Some may ask you to put away your presuppositions about homosexuality and to be objective, right? But inherent in that request is what? The presupposition that homosexuality is the same thing as heterosexuality. And perhaps it's here where we can begin. Carl Maria Kurt Benny. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Carl Kurt Benny. You've probably never heard of this name. Kurt Benny, however, is the man to give credit for these two terms, homosexual and heterosexual. That's right. You know, they didn't come out of the, what was that? Tower of Babel. No, Mr. Kurt Benny here was the one that coined it. He coined it in 1869. And according to an expert of genealogies of identity that I found on Brill.com, in the midst of political discussions about the unification of Germany, that's when he found these terms. Kurt Benny wanted to decriminalize homosexuality. He stood against what was called Paragraph 175 over in Germany. And the statute was banned, or I should say the statute banned sexual acts between men. Now, paragraph 175 was listed under the crimes and offenses against morality. I find that pretty interesting seeing that we certainly should have some moral laws, and we certainly do have them, but this one, people go crazy over having a law against homosexuality. And that's maybe something that we're going to get into later on in the episodes. But we want to stay on track here. From what I can tell, okay, Kurt Benny was not trying to coin a term and, let's say, drop it into common parlance or anything like that. He may have had only the desire, really, to define same-sex relationships in a different way that they were normally referred to, which was usually in a derogatory manner. Homosexuals, of course, have been around for a long time, so they didn't start existing when Mr. Kurt Benny said these words. But giving them a name seemed to properly distinguish them, and in some way would begin to lift them out of the dark holes they had become accustomed to. According to an encyclopedia entry by Matthew D. Johnson in the GLBTQ archive site, quote, the emergence of the term homosexual roughly coincided with these authorities' discovery of highly elaborated social networks of male persons in some European and North American cities. These men were typically understood to be effeminate in their appearance and demeanor, desiring and soliciting sexual contact exclusively with members of their own sex. By the close of the 19th century, these men had come to be known to jurists and medical practitioners as homosexuals, end quote. You know, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, they were known in the Bible as cities of the plain, right? And notorious for homosexual behavior, among other sins. But homosexuality was the sin that was happening there. And some people will actually sit there and they would argue this point with you. But interestingly enough, there may be reason to believe that cities, because of their makeup, tend to harbor and grow homosexual communities. Well, according to one paper written by Robert Aldrich, quote, since the time of the biblical Sodom and Gomorrah and classical Athens, homosexuality has been associated with the city. Now, this, of course, does seem to be the case. Pride parades, for example, didn't spread from small towns to big cities, but the other way around. According to one article, quote, there were at least 330 Pride festivals held in 2022 in the United States, almost half in towns with fewer than 50,000 people. And a town with fewer than 50,000 people is most definitely considered a small town. You can read that article at advocate.com. It would seem like then that small town America has gone the way of urbanization, and with it all the good and the bad that comes with it, including a growing influence from the LGBTQ community. Why is this so bad, you may ask? Well, to answer that question, we will leave the man who coined the term homosexuality behind and move on to an even more interesting character whose work seems to have swung the door wide open to the broad interest and eventual acceptance of sexual activities that once were relegated to the dark halls and dingy corners of society. A man, mind you, who would eventually be known as the Einstein of sex, and influenced a generation of sex experts that would in turn provide all the ingredients needed to give us the LGBTQ movement of today. You're listening to the Mind of Miz podcast. We'll be right back. Hello, family. It's Miz again. If you've made it this far into the podcast, consider subscribing, maybe even sharing this episode with a friend. And you can do all that other stuff too. You know the drill. Back to the podcast. Welcome back You're listening to the Mind of Miz podcast. There are more emotions and phenomena than words. That is the motto used at the start of Magnus Hirschfeld's book titled Transvestite. Now, in one sense, the proliferation of homosexual acceptance has been driven by men and women whose view of the world is naturalistic. Each new truth, I'm quoting Magnus Hirschfeld here, destroys the one before it. The deeper we are forced into the countless forms of the appearances in nature, the more is the unforeseen more obvious, end quote. If in your mind, the worldview prevails that humanity takes its cues from nature, then we have to accept every argument made by the LGBTQ community. Hands up, surrender, they got us. If, however, that worldview is a false one, and my worldview, which says we take our cues from our Creator God, is true, then everything associated with the LGBTQ community and the so-called gay liberation movement is nothing but a ploy to legalize and normalize the erotic passions of people. This sense of normalization is something that we will look at in our next episode, but it is important to make the distinction of worldviews. Magnus Hirschfeld definitely took his cues from nature and also from his own lustful lifestyle and also from those that he focused his work on who mostly shared his own worldview. And perhaps the argument can be made that echo chambers can exist on both sides, with both worldviews. But only my worldview has brought about Western civilization as we know it. And of course, it's not my own. It's the one the Bible provides. We will not have to speculate where a naturalistic worldview will take us. We've already seen it. We've seen it in every Marxist regime, from the Soviet Union to China today. You see, all we have to do is to see the religiosity of evolution and its preachers like Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, and that other guy, Sam Harris, among other prominent figures. All things homosexual has been defended in this way since the same time that evolution rolled around. Where at one point, the world was, in my opinion, properly viewed, meaning people saw the world as one that contained males and females. The dialogue eventually turned into what people expressed in terms of, well, there's a person who likes or loves something just like himself. Or you see another person, you say, well, there's someone who likes or loves something that's different than themselves. And we blurred the lines of male and female. This mindset has continued, and see, it has been propagated by the world. Men like Magnus Hirschfeld was one of them. There's that other guy, you probably know who I'm talking about, Sigmund Freud. But there's also more recent scholars, and, all that has devolved into the public square through activism and public support seen in parades today. But it's easy to go to a parade and have a party. It's much harder to deal with the realities of your worldview. And only a real look into the history of what has happened can help comprehend it all. And by way of application, we can set the worldview in order. Now, this worldview, of course, however, is not one that is only biblical by way of origin. I'm talking about the right worldview here, but must be biblical also by way of implementation. So the call then is always to repentance, unto salvation. You see, the homosexual cannot be saved by conversion into heterosexuality, for many heterosexuals are trapped in their own sexual perversions without the light of God. What I'm saying is that what is needed is a nation repenting of its sins before God. And we will talk more about this, but I must track a little slower to complete this historical picture of LGBTQ activism. Magnus Hirschfeld faced opposition from the Nazis as they would enforce paragraph 175, which we told you about, in ways that it had never been enforced before. Now, this has been used as a great little argument by many leaders in the LGBTQ movement to make it seem like if the Nazis were against this homosexual movement, then it must have been a horrible, thing, and that must make homosexuality so good. And so hopefully you can see through that little smoke screen that they provide for you. The author Mancini writes, quote, as the escalation of the right-wing forces during the final years of the Weimar Republic caused the situation to grow perilous beyond all doubt for Hirschfeld, he decided to expand his reach beyond Europe and embark upon a world lecture tour and something else, an ethnographic tour of the sexual customs of Asia and Northern Africa. End quote. Hirschfeld had sex on his mind at all times. Now, Mancini tells us that Hirschfeld believed, quote, cultural dogma and religious morals posed arbitrary hindrances to a deeper understanding of human sexuality. The question we must pose, however, is what is meant by a deeper understanding of human sexuality? And why does studying this sexuality by so-called sexologists have to do with biological truth and more with studying the behavioral patterns of people? It seems to me that the curiosity behind studying homosexuals at the end of the 19th century was pushed not by scientific intellectual curiosity, but a normalization of behaviors society at large had already deemed to be deviant. So whatever is meant by Mancini as to cultural dogmas and religious moral, it would serve us well to heed the words of G.K. Chesterton, who warned us of removing fences before asking why on earth they were put there to begin with. And I'm paraphrasing him there. Well, whatever hindrances cultural dogmas and religious morals provide, we ought to examine. But that was not the route that Hirschfeld took. He was quick to ask for the repeal of paragraph 175 without considering what moral underpinning he was removing. Though I suspect that someone as intellectual like Hirschfeld would have known that, but thought that his position was the moral high ground. And that is the problem, in part. Both sides argue from a moral point of view, but both cannot be right. Though that seems to be what the goal is. They want everybody to just hold hands and be on the same page. But in order to do that, one must capitulate to the other, because the two opinions are diametrically opposed. It has also proven true that whenever an inch is given, an arm is taken. But for the Christian, the answer is not in the organization of protests and elections. For far too long, that is the approach we have taken, and clearly it's not working. The church is not designed to be revolutionary, but the church is the only organism capable of spiritual reformation. In the time of the reformers, this was precisely what we saw happen. A new fervor ran through the church, and with it, a freedom to worship that ultimately culminated in the country that we now call the United States of America. The church, however, does seem to suffer of spiritual coldness from time to time, does it not? This leads to a soft approach when it comes to cultural shifts. You see, where the culture is often swift and fast, the church can often be sluggish and slow. Perhaps the effect of weak teaching inside of our four walls. That's just one man's opinion. Now, we don't have the time to dig into the state of the church in Germany at the time of the Weimar Republic, or when the Nazis even came to power. We do know the complications were vast. There was the Protestant church and the Catholic church, and those who saw the Weimar Republic as a threat, while others happily embraced the Nazis. There seem to have been indications that the rich Protestant history of Germany made some in the church feel compelled to stick to its traditions. The way that this was done, however, through an overemphasis or an overemphasized interest in political influence, seems to have backfired. At least that's what history would tell us. The truth is, Christian principles are not enough. The Puritans had it right when they pursued Christian living, but their political influence waned over time because governments are not a byproduct of the church. And if we're trying to fight our battles there in the political realm, we lose, as it seems so obvious to me that we're doing right now. The saving of America can only be found in the preaching of the gospel. It is important that we point out the ills of society and try to be informed about our histories. But if we are to socially commentate, we need to have the word of God in one hand while we diligently work with the other. You can't leave the word of God behind. The sphere of influence for the gay liberation movement, or LGBTQ today, is within the halls of power. But the true Christian knows that the heart of the king is in the hands of God. In this sense, we do not leave our post. We can provide information, and we should. We can be outspoken, and we should. But we cannot leave behind God's word. It was in the halls of power, in academia, and through the public square that gay liberation has made its progress. But even there, people like Hirschfeld found it difficult to navigate. In 1897, Hirschfeld founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. Mancini writes, quote, Hirschfeld believed that the purpose of human love was to endow human experience with spiritual meaning. The problem with this is that the sexual reform that Hirschfeld and many like him seek, well, it takes away the actual spiritual meaning God has given to sexuality between one man and one woman in marriage. Human love does not exist outside of God. Purpose for love, the only purpose for love, is to love God first. You see, once that is aligned properly, then we can rightfully aim towards one another. And it is my sincere belief, family, that the God kind of love cannot be expressed in homosexual acts. To endow human experience with spiritual meaning is to first adopt a false meaning of spirituality. And that can easily be done by applying euphoric and spiritual experiences to sexual behavior, regardless of who it's with. But anyone who is honest about sexual addiction would tell you that the spiral goes down, not up. In our next segment, we'll get into the different organizations that develop from the work and inspiration provided by Hirschfeld and others. And you will see how much of what sparked the pride culture you see today was the defense, not of a pure spiritual experience through sexual experience, but a defense and even demand of a seedy lifestyle that with the passing decades became more depraved and more dull. It must be noted that Hirschfeld's position was that homosexuality was inborn. That means it was natural, a natural part of life. This is an argument that we still hear today, is it not? And we'll have to address it more directly later. But for now, I want to make the point that for Hirschfeld, at least for those who defend him, since it's pretty difficult to defend Hirschfeld completely on this point if you read through his whole story. But in the eyes of those that look up to Hirschfeld, his mission was a good mission. The way they saw the world was that if homosexuality was a natural part of life, then no homosexual should be criminalized for being a homosexual. This was the same cry right up to the gay community in the 60s, and which eventually granted them legal protection from discrimination. And we'll have to address this biblical perspective on this matter as we continue. But the legalizing of a behavior seems like an odd thing, generally speaking. When it comes to personal decisions, I grant that the US government or any government shouldn't intervene. Unless personal choices affect the freedoms of another person, you should be able to make your own life choices. But as I have already mentioned before, the giving of an inch leads to the taking of an arm. The question then becomes, when and how much do you give? These questions are not going to be fully answered today in this episode, but we can ponder them. What the gay liberation movement did was make sinful practice legal. And by protecting these so-called rights, the rights of others today is infringed upon, particularly people of faith who cannot align with the homosexual agenda. In some ways, we can say that was started with the attempt of decriminalizing homosexual behavior, ended up in a clamor for sexual freedom. The problem is that this sexual freedom knows no bounds. Because as we have already pointed out, Hirschfeld thought any dogmas, any morals were hindrances to the deeper understandings of sexuality. But the deeper understandings of sexuality, if you notice, never ever tilts in the direction of sexual purity. Abstinence, it's hardly an option. The options are sex and more of it. And the wilder and more exotic, the better. The more partners, the more you get to understand it. It becomes absolute sexual anarchy. And that is dangerous in any society. Dr. Hirschfeld's Scientific Humanitarian Committee was the first LGBT emancipation organization, according to the Legacy Project. And at its peak, only had some 700 people and came to an abrupt end. But in some ways, this organization, with its singular focus on freedom, or on sexual freedom, I should say, became, if not the blueprint, the foundation of many other organizations like it that would turn into a juggernaut that would, in my opinion, shake the moral foundations of our country and perhaps later in the future, maybe close, obliterated altogether. You're listening to the Mind of Miz podcast. Hello, family. Miz here. This episode is part of a larger series of episodes that we've titled Pride, Prejudice, and Purpose. In these episodes, we explore what the LGBTQ meaning of pride really is and how we got to massive Pride Month celebrations nationwide. We look at the prejudices within the ideology of pride and how preconceived opinions about sex, homosexuality, gender, and sexuality in general have created the unreasonable world of LGBTQ that we see today. Lastly, we examine the purpose for the massive political push and what, if anything, we can do to turn the tide. Look for our other episodes in the series on Spotify, iHeartRadio, or TuneIn, and continue the conversation on our Twitter page or at mindofmiz.com. Now, back to the podcast. All right, welcome back. You are listening to the Mind of Miz podcast. Gender affirming surgeries. That's what we're going to talk about in this segment. And we can say that gender affirming surgeries are probably the most extreme way of affirming your gender. If there's one thing that you want to do to affirm your gender and say, let's say you were born a biological man and you want to absolutely affirm that what you are is a woman, what you do is you get a gender affirming surgery. That is kind of the epitome, okay, of affirmation, if you want to put it that way. Now, while nature, though, of course, I would say God has spoken quite clearly as to what gender we are by giving us a male and female organ that he gives to us accordingly as he pleases. At least that's my theological view and my worldview. It has become acceptable and increasingly common, even, I would say, to accept that what a person either thinks or feels about their gender is actually truer than the organs that they were born with. Okay. Now, one of the most misleading statements that we hear come from activists, whether they're for the LGBTQ or transgender specifically, and I would even say from those that profit from from performing, I would say gender affirming care. What we hear is that people are assigned their gender at birth. Okay, that's what they're assigned with. And I think it's one of the most misleading and as a new term that I've heard, anti-truth. And I think that would qualify as that. Or to make it even simpler, we can just call it a lie. Now, these so-called assignments that people call subjective they're not subjective at all. They're actually pretty objective and reasonable, and I don't know, maybe quite scientific, as you can get. All you do is examine the area where the organs are, and well, then you know what the gender is. And so, no, there is no assigning of gender at birth. There's just truth telling. Now, today, there might be such a thing as you have a baby boy and you want to, say that they're a baby girl. Well, that is technically what assigning a gender would be, particularly when those biological parts say otherwise. Now, of course, the words gender and sex have been as mutilated as have been our children that undergo gender affirming surgeries. But if you've heard my segment that we did here earlier on how the term homosexual actually came to be, then you know that the ideology that pushes the LGBTQ agenda forward is always going to play with words. That's what they do. Now, in a Reuters article titled "Putting Numbers on the Rise in Children Seeking Gender Care," Reuters and Komodo, now Komodo's a health technology company, they found that 282 top surgeries were performed in the United States. And that number has steadily grown since 2019. Now, top surgery, for you that don't know, according to Johns Hopkins Medicine and their featured expert, that's right, they have a featured expert on gender affirming surgeries, Dr. Fan Liang. She says, quote, surgery that removes or augments breast tissue and reshapes the chest to create a more masculine or feminine appearance for transgender and non-binary people. That is what top surgery is. Now, from the National Institute of Health, the world's famous NIH, a total, quote, of 1,047 patients, or 13.2% of the sample, underwent one or more gender-affirming surgeries from 2009 to 2015, with the number of patients, listen to this, undergoing surgeries increasing over the sample period. Now, there were a total, they continue, of 401 mastectomies, 62 breast augmentations, 60 phalloplasties, 193 vaginoplasties, 189 hysterectomies, and 93 orchiotomies. I think I said that right in the sample. Mastectomy was the most common procedure represented within the sample, accounting for 11.7% of all procedures. Okay, so they finish here by saying that phalloplasty was the least common procedure, 5.7%. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, that's not that many, well, consider that these surgeries, okay, are being done to people who otherwise are perfectly healthy, okay? There's no reason to remove any of these parts. Now, there are reasons, okay, why you may want to get, let's say, a hysterectomy, okay? There's reasons for that, or even an orchiotomy as well. But it doesn't seem like those things were meant to be for so-called gender-affirming surgeries, okay? So really, the only reason that these surgeries, these numbers that we just described, are taking place is because someone either felt or thought that they were a different gender than what their male or female organ was actually telling them that they were. But I think there's something a little more sinister happening here in this Reuters article, and I've been quoting to you from it, okay? Now, I'm the one calling it sinister. Reuters is not, so let's make that clear. But look at these numbers. For example, okay, the diagnosis of minors ages 6 to 17 with gender dysphoria went from 15,000, just over 15,000 in 2017 to 42,000 in 2021, okay? That's, again, ages 6 to 17. have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. The number is increasing at a radically fast pace. In 2017, for example, 633 minors aged 6 to 17 initiated puberty blocker treatments. Now, think about that for just a second. You're age 6 and you're already getting puberty blocker treatments. And of course, this number has increased to just over 1,300 in 2021. Reuters writes, quote, "For children at this age and stage of development, puberty blocking medications are an option." Okay. But these drugs, known as GnRH agonists, suppress the release of the sex hormones testosterone and estrogen. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, we trust them, has approved the drugs to treat prostate cancer, endometriosis, and central precocious puberty, but not gender dysphoria. So we're giving children as young as 6 years old medication that's meant to treat prostate cancer. Does that make any sense to anyone? Quote, "Their off-label use in gender-affirming care, while legal, lacks the support of clinical trials to establish their safety for such treatment." You think? That's Reuters. It's not even me saying that, although I agree with their assessment. Now, these numbers, according to the same article, are, quote, "likely an undercount." That's right. It's an undercount. Why? Well, tells us Reuters, because they didn't include treatment that wasn't covered by insurance and were limited to pediatric patients with a gender dysphoria diagnosis. That paragraph ends with this interesting quote: "Practitioners may not log this diagnosis when prescribing treatment." So here we have doctors that are not even logging in the diagnosis, but performing these treatments. So likely there's an undercount, meaning there's more of these surgeries happening. There's more of these treatments being done. Now, the same age group, age 6 to 17, in the year 2017, 1,900 patients started hormone treatments. Okay. By 2021, the number of hormone treatments had gone up to 4,231. I already gave you the numbers on top surgery, but how about genital surgery? Okay, here's actually what the article had to say. Quote, "The Komodo analysis of insurance claims found 56 surgeries among patients ages 13 to 17. Well, at least they left the 6-year-olds alone, right? Well, that's good, sort of. We're just going to go as young as 13 before we touch the genitals. And these, of course, had a prior gender dysphoria diagnosis from 2019 to 2021. So is this an undercount too? Maybe. Because it says this in the article, quote, "This study does not include procedures that were paid for out of pocket." So there you go. You do with that what you want. Now, there is one person that I know of that would grin just reading these numbers. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, Magnus Hirschfeld. And we'll talk about him when we come back. You're listening to the Mind of Ms. podcast. Hello, family. We are working on a special project. It's impossible to put all the information we learn when we research our podcast topics into one episode or even one whole series. So we've decided to put it in a book, Pride, Prejudice, and Purpose, the ebook. Want more information? Send us an email to info@mindofmiz.com and we'll put you on our waiting list. And you'll be the first to know when we release the ebook. Now, back to the podcast. All right, welcome back. You're listening to the Mind of Ms. podcast. Now, like we said, there is one person that would be grinning, okay, from ear to ear if he heard these growing numbers of gender-affirming surgeries. And his name, of course, is Magnus Hirschfeld. And you might ask, well, why? Why would he be grinning from ear to ear if he heard these gender-affirming surgery growing numbers? Well, the story goes that Hirschfeld once had a soldier come to him. In the middle of the night, he came, and it was a young man. And this young man, who was a soldier, confessed to Hirschfeld that he was a homosexual. And well, Hirschfeld did what he could to help the young lad out. What he did exactly, well, not too sure about that, but the fact was this, that talking about these kinds of things could seriously jeopardize a man. Remember paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexuality, was in effect. Now, the young soldier, who could not apparently be consoled, is said that he tragically took his own life on the eve of all days of his wedding. See, being a homosexual, he couldn't fathom being married to a woman for the rest of his life. Now, there's some tragedy, obviously, in this story, and so we don't want to just buzz by these tragedy. When someone takes their life, that is a extremely serious thing, and we should not just let people think that that is an option. There was a lot of mental distress here, obviously, for this young man, and that is true for anyone, especially if they're under threat from the government, okay, from making personal choices like living a homosexual lifestyle. Now, I can almost hear you saying, hey, wait a minute, homosexuality is not about a choice. It's how you're born. This is natural. And, we'll have to dig deeper into that in a future episode coming in this series. But, taking your life is never the solution. And getting wrapped into circumstances that place extraordinary pressures on you is also not good. Now, granted, culture and society may place pressures on us, okay? They're all around us. There's rules that are in society that we don't always, like. We're all supposed to stay put on red lights, right, for example. And there was a time, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a time in our society where walking out of Walmart with piles of merchandise slightly before under the value of $1,000 was actually not acceptable in our society. But make laws that make such things acceptable, and more people will do it. Pass laws that make sexual freedom not just legal, but nearly impossible to oppose, even from a position of religious freedom or something as simple that we all, I think, agree on, freedom of speech, and sit back and watch your culture and society disintegrate. So here we have this young man who desires other men sexually. That's what homosexuality is all about. It's not about long-term relationships that produce healthy family units based on things like love and responsibility and duty. And that's not just to say that there's same-sex couples out there today, that's exactly what they're trying to do. But that never was the point of homosexuality. That's not where it starts. The love factor, for example, that's floated about, like the one touted by Chief Justice John Roberts. Remember in the court's opinion in their decision on Obergefell versus Hodges, 2015, which legalized same-sex marriage throughout the land, is the byproduct, that kind of love that he mentions there. If you haven't read that opinion, you should go and read it. But that kind of love that he's talking about there is the product of what I would call forced normalization, okay? Now, marriage is not something humans instituted. God did. That's my belief. That's what I stand by. And the parameters for it then are not about sexual feelings that we can then label love. They're about a helpmate. They're about two people fit for one another. Now, in marriage, for example, procreation is most acceptable. And it is, by the way, between a man and a woman. The roles are defined. If we look at this biblically, the man loves his wife, the wife respects her husband. Christ is the head of the husband, and the husband the head of the wife. I think I just heard a feminist yelling at me, but it's the truth. And the children, guess what the children do? Well, they don't get gender affirming surgeries. They just learn to honor their father and their mother. Now, all of this, of course, is flipped on its head when we pretend that same-sex relationships are not primarily about unfettered sexual pleasures, but rather love. It's the effect, I would say, of the pendulum swinging to the other side, where the feminists say something like, women can do anything a man can do. Homosexuals say homosexuals can do whatever heterosexuals can do. Now, not long after the suicide of this young soldier, Magnus Hirschfeld finds himself holding a note from the dead soldier that reads, quote, "The thought that you could contribute to a future when the German fatherland will think of us in more just terms sweetens the hour of death." Now Hirschfeld is distraught, and it was this moment that now pushes him to dedicate his entire life and the remainder of his life, which was still a long way off, to fight for homosexual rights. But if all that Hirschfeld wanted to do, and all he was trying to do, was liberate homosexuals from the tyranny of paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexuality, what on earth was he doing performing gender-affirming surgeries? Well, Hirschfeld, he left his medical practice to specialize in sexual health. His goal was to prove to the world that homosexuality was just another part of being human. Now, at the time when Hirschfeld made this radical change, and all the way up to 1974, as we said earlier, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. Hirschfeld, well, he wanted to debunk this idea and argued for what he called a third sex, a sex that was non-binary. Have you heard that before? That allowed people to like the same thing, to like both kinds of things, and maybe even other things. Well, Hirschfeld would take the behavioral patterns of individuals when it came to sex and was looking for a way to normalize it and bring it into acceptance among the rest of the world. And if we look around today, his goals seem to be moving along quite nicely. At what cost to our society? Well, we'll have to explore that as we go along. There's another example in the Hirschfeld story of another soldier who described to Hirschfeld that wearing women's clothing was a chance for him to feel human, even if it was only for a brief moment. But can't someone make the same argument that going nude makes them feel human? But we have yet to allow men and women to freely walk about in the nude. Though I have no doubts that plenty of people would jump at the opportunity. Now, if you don't agree that there is something off or weird, or to use the word as it was intended to be used originally, queer, about all this, then you have been bamboozled into believing the woke claims of our day. You see, Hirschfeld and others like him, they did not fight for moving from criminalizing homosexuality to labeling it to be a problem in society. And you might wonder, well, why would they do that? Why would they call homosexuality a problem? Well, I would imagine that if they made homosexuality illegal, it was because it was not good for society. Something happened. But that's not what he did. He didn't just want to label it a problem. He went straight for the jugular, and he defended homosexuality as natural. Now, I have to be clear here. I'm not arguing that homosexuality is normal or that it is abnormal. I believe that we're made in the image of God. Therefore, all sin, okay, all sin is abnormal. You see, the Bible teaches that when Adam sinned, death came about. And death is abnormal in this sense. The Bible teaches that death spread to all of humanity because every single human being sinned. Therefore, sin and death are abnormal. The only sense that sin is normal is in the sin nature, which is what the believer is freed from when he comes in repentance to Jesus Christ. Therefore, we can argue that homosexuality is normal within the sin nature, because sin, or homosexuality, I should say, is a sin. But it's abnormal to the believer who has been freed from the sin nature. In that sense, then it's abnormal to God, and well, I think he has the final say on all these things. So the argument then is not, is homosexuality as normal as heterosexuality? All these terms do is describe what sex you are attracted to. The argument is regarding what is sinful or not regarding sexuality generally. Now, the arguments have been made that homosexuality is a mental disorder or not becomes irrelevant to the moral question in some sense. That is not to say that we don't concern ourselves with someone who may have a mental disorder, because we should. But where the LGBTQ community has been clever is in formulating the argument that sex is normal for humans, and that since that's the case, some humans just happen to be homosexuals while others are heterosexuals. In other words, they have created a distinction where a distinction did not have to be made. It has been obvious to humans for essentially all of our existence that some people were attracted to and engaged sexually with the same sex. But it was obvious to humans that it was weird or odd or queer. Putting aside the biblical mandates regarding homosexuality for just a moment, homosexual acts have been largely marginal in societies. We don't come across many civilizations that were gay or mostly gay, but we do know that homosexuals have always been around somewhere. The confusion comes in because increasingly those in the gay community are less and less inclined to think that being with someone of the same sex is not generally common. Humans reproduce. The way to do that, by the way, is with a man and a woman. The product of that union, particularly in marriage, has shown to the world to be beneficial and considered then normative. to see someone then engage with another of the same sex would seem strange. And if we are honest, the homosexual lifestyle tends towards debauchery and not social stability. So it's no wonder that people stigmatize it. You see, but the problem is that all these things get flipped on the head when we're told that all things LGBTQ are par for the course. That men can get pregnant, that transgender women can be female athletic champions, that drag queens have every right to dance erotically in front of children and read them books. The proliferation, then, of abnormality is not that people don't understand that some people are attracted to the same sex. The abnormality lies in that people who advocate for the sexual freedom of those who engage in same-sex activities are wanting a form of anarchy when it comes to sex. The pursuit, then, to normalize pushed Hirschfeld to open the Institute for Sexual Research in 1919. By the 1930s, Hirschfeld was performing the first gender-affirming surgeries in the world. You're listening to the Mind of Ms. podcast. Next time on the Mind of Ms. podcast, we'll continue with part 2 of a history of LGBTQ activism. In this episode, you will learn more about the groups that push the gay liberation movement forward. Organizations like the Daughters of Bilitis, One Incorporated, and the Mattachine Society. We'll take a look at the Stonewall riots and their role in the formulation of gay celebrations all across American cities, and how we got to a national celebration called Pride Month. Thank you for listening. Remember to support our work here at the Mind of Ms. podcast. Just go to mindofms.com/support or give using the Support Us link in the show notes. You've been listening to the Mind of Ms. podcast.